All right, welcome back to the Ottawa studios of Inside My Canoe Head. I'm your host, Dr. D. Today, we are going to talk about Preparedness 101 for 2025. And while your traditional preparedness is going to need to look a little different for these disruptive times. So sit back, grab yourself your favorite beverage. Let's get at her. All right, welcome back. Aren't these some pretty crazy times? Welcome to 2025 and what seems to be a totally, as my old late uncle would say, a discombobulated set of events that have us all stressed out to the nines. Nobody knows what's going to happen next. Everything seems to be a shock and a surprise. And people are doing and saying things that we just don't understand the reason why, what the motives may be, etc. And this is often the case when you're even having family discussions about politics and economics and any other subject like that, where we really don't understand the reasons why things happen. But what we do get is very much emotionally engaged. And so if I was to name the current U.S. president to most listeners, I am going to get an emotional reaction. It's going to be many different ones. It's going to be negative or positive, but it is probably going to be an emotional reaction. And that is not new to politics, right? Just because you have a polarizing figure in the office at a certain time, you could say the same thing about the current Canadian Prime Minister. You could say the same thing about the outgoing German Chancellor. You could say the same thing about the current Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. We could go on and on about political leaders as they exist today are very, very polarizing figures. There are but a few who represent some form of normalized civility or normalcy or some path. The reason that matters is what's happening today in our collective societies is that we are getting wrapped up in the emotional side of the world around it. And I get it. And I'm not lessening anybody's emotional condition and response to the world around them. But the reality is you are living your life or trying to live your life the way you want. You have a set of dreams that you're pursuing. You have a set of things you're trying to accomplish. You have a life strategy. Now, whether you've actually sat down and gone through and exercised and look at the different spheres of influence that we're going to talk about today in the podcast and examined your current life and you've made a strategic plan for go from A to B, whether you've done the actual formal exercise of developing a current life strategy with goalposts and milestones, or you're just rocking it every day or trying to, you're probably following a path and you have some goals. When you sit down, and I often say at the beginning of and I say at the beginning of every episode, grab your favorite beverage, let's get at her. Because a lot of times a simple favorite beverage and sitting down it within your hands in a calm environment is the best place to think. And there was a great podcast episode that I listened to on Rich Roll, and he had somebody on there that was talking about the human brain and thinking. And I said this a couple of podcast episodes ago, and it's worth repeating, is that we often prevent our brain from doing what it's supposed to. There's a frontal cortex part of our brain that's responsible for thinking and problem solving, right? We have a basic part of our brain that sends a whole bunch of alerts, right? Crazy saber-toothed tiger, hot potential mate over there, whatever it may be. You get all kinds of these inputs from nature, but you have a frontal cortex part of your brain that thinks and analyzes and makes decisions. In our current society, we're putting so much electronic stimuli in front of it that we're basically overwhelming our brain's ability to cognitively think through problems, right? So a lot of people fail in their ability to problem solve simply because they're over consuming or overstimulating their frontal cortex, which is why we think in the shower. We solve problems in the shower because in the shower, you're not staring at a screen. Most people don't have screens in their shower. They don't bring their phone. They're in there and they're sitting there and they're I love showers. They're hanging out under the hot water, and I could take 5 30-minute showers every day and love it. and you think. You think because you've stopped overstimulating the frontal cortex and it starts to do what it's supposed to do and problem solve. But we don't do that. So we live in an emotional state where we don't realize that the world is what it is, and there's so very little we have influence. Now, the Stoic philosophers will tell you that we have very little control over what's around us, and that's perfectly acceptable. That's the way we want it. The problem is not that you can change the world around you, it's that we fail to understand that it is beyond our control, right? So, for example, in a democracy, I live in Canada, it's a democracy. We're in the middle of a provincial election equivalent to a state election that is coming up. It's going to be this Thursday. We're all going to vote. I have a say in a democracy, but what I don't have is the final say. I will go and put my ballot in. I believe it's my duty and responsibility as one of the obligations of having the wonderful privilege of living in a democracy is that I have an obligation to make the best decision. Now, if the 3 or 4 offerings on the table are all fools, then I do have the job to pick the lesser fool and vote for them. Fair enough. You can argue with me on that. The point being is I might not like the outcome. I may not accept the outcome in some form, but the outcome is real. And whomever wins the election on Thursday in the province of Ontario in Canada is going to govern for the next 4 years. Approximately, we live in a parliamentary system, so you can shut down legislature whenever you want and call an election. But generally, for the next 4 years. It doesn't matter whether I like the premier, which is the equivalent of an American state governor. It doesn't matter. They're in charge. Their policies will govern how my life works to some degree. My responsibility as an individual is to figure out how to navigate that and how that's going to impact on what I do. This is preparedness for 2025. It looks different than what you traditionally think in the form of natural disasters, earthquakes, tornadoes. Those all remain present, power outages, things like that. But because we live in such a tumultuous 2020 decade, very predictably so, we saw this coming like a freight train. Maybe not the pandemic and a few wars and stuff, but this is the decade that humanity is going to reorganize. It always was going to be the 2020s. And so we don't know what the outcome it is. We don't know what the next event will be. We don't know what the series of impacts will be, but we know that they're all going to be beyond our control. And we know that some of them are going to have some pretty significant influence on us, depending on where we live. Right? So whether you're American or Canadian, the just previous election in America or the coming election in Canada will be consequential as to how you do. If you're somebody like me who owns a business that sells across the international border and we now have a potential trade war with our neighbors to the south, that impacts me. It doesn't matter how angry I get about the trade tariffs. It doesn't matter what my political or economic viewpoints are on it. Those are really quite irrelevant. I'm operating a business that's living in this environment. So I can get angry, frustrated, and mad all I want, but none of that helps me and none of that helps my business. All it does is cause emotional turmoil. So for Preparedness 2025, the first primary step is about understanding that you have to accept that the world is what it is. It doesn't matter whether you agree with it, but you have to figure out how you're going to navigate that. So that's a big question, right? How do you figure out? And there's many different units of measure. When we talk about units of measure, you can think about preparedness through the lens of you as an individual, just me, rocking my life in this world. You can think of your family unit. You can think of your community, your state, your region, your country, or an international group of nations. It doesn't matter your frame. The general idea is the same. You are exposed to a series of threats and hazards that have nothing to do with you, but because of the country you're in and the location you've chosen to live, these and the political events that are ongoing, you are exposed to a whole host of threats. Preparedness for 2025 is about understanding first risk identification. What am I exposed to? Classifying the severity of those risks, codifying the ones that are of high risk, and then figuring out a mitigation strategy. So it's risk identification, risk mitigation, and a strategy. And that's your process at the unit of measure. So whether you're sitting back listening to this podcast thinking, how do I get my family ready to navigate this crazy decade, right? It's upside down, it's twisted sideways, it's ridiculous, whatever. How does my family and my kids growing up in this decade become successful? What do I have to do to help that to happen? Knowing there's no absolutes. You can't prevent a disaster from happening. You can't use that language because we can't. And in other words, you can't guarantee a successful outcome because that's an absolute. There are no absolutes. Everything in the world is across some form of success and some measure of failure. So when you understand your unit of measure, whether you're thinking about your community, yourself as an individual, your family, or a small group of friends, or even what we offer, the same thing works if you're in an organizational sense, right? So for example, I'm on the board of directors of the International Social Capital Association. How do I think about preparing that organization as it delivers its mandate in a very disruptive world environment, right? We talk about the power of human beings and the power of human relationships to solve and address the problems that we face across all spectrums, across all parts of the world. Now, I work in the disaster resilience space. How do we leverage the power of community to do better and have better post-event outcomes? But all of that not-for-profit work that we do exists in a world we don't control. So we have a set of threats that the organization is exposed to. So you can see how this general strategy, and remember, this is a simplification to give you guidance on what Preparedness 2025 should look like for you. Now, when we think about human life, right? If we think about all of the things that influence you now, we used to traditionally think of preparedness as a natural disaster, right? It was all about earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, wildfires, whatever it may be. Now, in a lot of the current climate in the emergency management space, they're fighting back against the use of the phrase natural disasters. And they're doing that because they believe, and I disagree, but they believe that the disasters are not natural. They're all because humans. Like earthquake is not a problem. It's the fact that humans built their homes on an earthquake fault and then chose to not build them to a point where they would be survived. You know what I mean? Like the reasons these events turn into disasters is not the natural side of it. It's the human decisions. Now, I get the ideological view behind that. I think it's fairly pointless argument, to be frank with you. But the challenge that we have is we can't, the resources that humanity needs to survive, food, water, energy, all exist in precarious locations. They don't exist in safe locations. Call it the design of nature, call it divine intervention, whatever you want. But all of the fresh food, the arable land exists in Tornado Alley. All of the fishing exists in wonderful rivers that flood periodically. And so we want our civilizations, and we traditionally have always built our civilizations very, very close to water routes and communication routes and where the resources are. So we positioned our cities right next to the resources we needed to survive. And by doing so, we exposed those cities to increased level of hazard. So, it's not really natural disaster phraseology is not the problem. That's my opinion. But the point here is that that's traditionally what we've seen preparedness to be. That's the extent emergency preparedness week that happens. Everybody thinks about their kit, be informed, have a plan, that kind of thing, to deal with natural disasters that may affect you. Preparedness for 2025 has to deal with the other 80%. You've all heard of a Pareto problem based upon a scientist that said, 20%, 80% of your problems from 20% of the things that you're doing. And basically it means that natural disasters and those induced things that require preparedness represent only about 20% of the total preparedness space. And when we look at a generally acceptable summation of what sociology, anthropology, psychology, and behavioral economics talks about is there's really 5 spheres of influence in the human existence. And when we think about that, we think political, economic, cultural, natural, and familial, right? Those are the 5 areas of your life, 5 areas of influence generally on you. So there's a political imposition on you of some degree. There's an economic model that governs how you work economically. There's a cultural model of how you were raised and what cultural ethos that you fall into. There's a natural set of hazards and a natural space in which you live. And then there's your familial dynamics, right? And trust me, sometimes family disasters are just as bad as an earthquake. But you have 5 areas of influence. If we accept that you have 5 areas of influence, and this is a generalized idea, but I use it because we need a frame, right? We can't figure out how to manage risk unless we have a frame. So if you work with me and accept that those are the 5 areas, and I don't care what your unit of measure is, whether it's you, your family, community, it doesn't matter. Each unit of measure has exposure to 5 areas. And if we look at those 5 areas and you sit back and say, okay, I'm going to talk about my family. My family, what political influences are we exposed to, right? What economic things are we exposed to? And there is a whole drawn out list of them. In fact, there's about 195 questions that you can ask yourself. But the general idea is for you to reflect on those 5 areas and say, what political risks or events are we exposed to that are beyond our control that are likely going to influence how my family wants to live their life? Ask that question across all 5 spheres, and you'll generate, and you have to take some time with this. Don't be quick, because if you really want to understand the risk profile to which you're exposed, which I'm arguing today is the key foundation for Preparedness 2025, is you've really got to spend some time on this. You know, if you come up with 10 or 15 risks or potential events that could influence how you want to live your life, remember, that's the frame. How you and your family want to live your life and what political events could influence that. You end up getting a list of 10 or 15 per each. So you take 15, you multiply it by 5. Right? You have 15 times 5 is 75, right? So you have 75 potential identified risks. Now you codify those risks, which means you assess them and you have 3 choices. Low choice is low risk. There's no such thing as no risk. Everything is a risk to some degree. But low risk is basically something that you would say it is what it is. I might not like it, but it really doesn't have an impact on me, so I'm not going to waste any of my thought, time, and energy concerned about it. Fine. Fair. Then you have manageable risks. These are things that if they did occur, they're going to impact you and your family and how you intend to live your lives, but it is well within your control to navigate, right? You already can make your way through that kind of event. The high risk and unacceptable level are those events or those ideas or those ideologies that if they were to bear fruit and come to reality, they would cause significant disruption to the point where your family couldn't manage, right? It could be the closing of your mill. It could be the election of somebody coming in and canceling a public policy for which you generally benefit. For example, there have been some calls in Canada for the cancellation of all transfers to individuals from the federal government because we're in such dire need that the next federal government may simply have to cancel all checks that go out, right? So no GST tax credits, no childcare benefits, all of that stuff just has to go away for a period of time because the government is broke and it needs to pay its bills because we're way overspent. For some people that wouldn't matter, but if you rely on a pretty significant check from the government of Canada or any government every month to pay your bills, that change in policy represents a high risk, something that your family can't manage. That will cause such significant harm. These are the type of things that you think through. And again, when you think about that, you'll understand the amount of time that we're talking about to go through these 5 areas of influence at your unit of measure, which is your family, and then figure out all the risks that you're exposed to, and then go through and assess all of them. Again, preparedness doesn't cost any money. It is absolutely free, but it does require time and effort. That is not free. You have to commit to that. Nobody can do it for you, because as the unit of measure gets smaller and smaller. So when we, everybody's exposure is kind of the same at the international, national, and subnational level. But when you start getting down to regional community organizations and individual families, they live their lives so differently, and they're after different things, that you can't create a PDF downloadable form filler for people to fill out to develop a personal preparedness plan, right? You can set the frame for them and ask them to pose the questions. The answers they generate will follow on and become the roadmap and their plan and their strategy, right? I can't give it to anybody, because you have to be identified through your own risk profile, through your own risk tolerance. What you accept and don't accept is going to be different than your neighbor. So the very same situation affecting two different families, both families may look at risk differently. One may be very, very risk adverse and don't like chances, taking their chances. And the other one is the type of person that just says, I'll deal with it. No biggie, no worries, right? Same set of events, identical looking families, two distinctly different frames and views. So when you get that list of the high level of risk or a high level of impact to your family that is unacceptable and it needs addressing, you've now determined your roadmap, your mitigation roadmap. Now, what this is, it usually turns out to be about 4 to 7 things that come out of that 75. So it's generally not a high amount, to be honest with you, but you're going to have 4 to 7 things that, if they were realized, represent an existential threat to the continued plan of your family. Now, before they happen, again, this is preparedness. Before these things become reality, or before they are reality and before they have that impact, you sit down and now you figure out, how do I mitigate against this? And I'll use the example. If the government of Canada comes out and says, due to the fact of deficit financing and the economic troubles we're having with the Americans and the cost to the Canadian society, we're going to have to immediately and summarily cancel all checks to individuals. What are you going to do? How do you intend to mitigate that? There's lots of economic strategies out there. There's lots of ways to do it. There is no right or wrong way. The wrong way is ignoring it. The right way is saying, this could happen. It's the same as when we talk about your trifecta of preparedness plans in all of our work and books that we offer at preparednesslabs.ca. We talk about the fact that you better have a plan for when you're fired. Because in these challenging economic times, if you don't highlight getting fired as one of a significant risks that you face, then you're not seriously considering the risk profile out there. I don't care if you're an indeterminate public servant. It is irrelevant. You are exposed to the possibility that you will be fired. So what exact is your current strategy for when you walk into work tomorrow on Wednesday morning, or whatever day you're listening to this podcast, your next work day, ready to get after it, say hi to your friends, pour a cup of coffee, and start getting, making a difference in the world, and you're fired. You're simply fired. Or you just get an email. You're fired by tech support. You try to log in and there's nothing there, and your personal email has a short invite to a 10-minute Zoom meeting, and you're about to get fired en masse. It doesn't matter whether you like it. That is a unique and distinct possibility, and we have seen it come to fruition many times over. You can get fired. It doesn't matter what your union contract says. You can get fired. Now, you may have benefits that are in the union contract, and you consider those as part of your mitigation strategy, but you better be thinking about getting fired. That's just an example, right? And when you sit down and you have those high risks, that 4 to 7 usually on average things that you need to address, and you start writing out mitigation strategies of what you think you can do that is within your wherewithal to mitigate and plan for the eventual happening of these items, so that you have a strategy for you and your family to navigate the future. What you've just done is create your preparedness roadmap for 2025. You've just made the effort to set your family up for success so that when these events happen that are beyond your control and are outside your ability to influence, you can then say, hey, I got fired. I had my 24-hour pity party where I had my little cry and my whiskey drink and all that stuff. And then you got up the next day and you pulled out your mitigation strategy that you had written while you still had a job in times of peace and calm, with a very detailed analysis of how you're going to go about and replace that lost income, right? So you're not fishing around, you're not swimming around. There'll be stress and anxiety, but it'll be much less if you have a preparedness mitigation strategy. But you can't write a preparedness mitigation strategy unless you've actually done a risk analysis, because you don't know the threats against which you got to mitigate. And how do you figure out how to do that? We walk ourselves all the way back to that generalization of the 5 areas of influence, or the frames, as I call them, that I offered for you to consider. It is not a perfect answer. Science is imperfect. It's a great idea. It's based upon the evidence. It's what I use in my family. It's what I use with my close friends. It's what I use in my community. I have an incredible opportunity this evening that I get to address my community association and start to talk to the residents of my community about the need to adopt a culture of preparedness. And the idea behind a culture of preparedness is quite simple. It is simply understanding that in these chaotic times, it is unequivocally your responsibility to get your family or your unit of measure ready to the greatest extent you can. Nobody will be always ready for everything. But when you create those mitigation plans to the identified high-risk things that you found, and you have a strategy, and when you're done that mitigation and you're happy with it and you're comfortable with it, guess what happens to your overall stress and anxiety about the world in 2025? It starts to go down. You'll still be angry. You'll still shake your head. You'll still call certain people buffoons and idiots. But guess what? Your stress and anxiety about those events will be much lower, because you know that you've taken the step to protect your family against potential future influence for decisions and events that are beyond your control. And again, to summarize it, that's exactly what this is. This is about things you cannot control. You cannot control the political and economic decisions that are happening around you, the international policy that drives you nuts, your local mayor's decision to invest in one thing versus another, the change in legislation, the change in regulatory frameworks. You come in and HOA turns to start to change various different things and you don't agree with it. But guess what? You signed the forms when you bought your house. Well, guess what? All of that falls into what you should be considering preparedness for 2025. So yeah, absolutely. Don't forget your natural disaster stuff and all that, but that only represents 20% of preparedness. Don't be the person that buries your head in the sand thinking that just because you gathered a couple emergency kits and you've got a wind-up radio, that somehow you've adopted preparedness in 2025. You've just adopted preparedness for 1972. Congratulations. You've got much more work to do. That's what we've outlined here. Drop over to our website, insidemycanoehead.ca. We're going to undergo some changes there soon. If you drop over to our parent website, preparednesslabs.ca, and I ask you to go there and poke around, it's new. It's on a different platform now. We're making some changes to it. It looks a bit confusing. I am the IT department. I am the design department. And so we're going through iteration. We're doing a hard launch in the first week of April, the soft launch sometime in March. So I'd love your feedback on what you think about the new website, how it's structured, and we're going to re-roll out some of our offerings that were on the other platform, and they're now put to rest. And there'll be new ones coming out that are much more applicable for this disruptive 2025. And I think that's the important part of what we're talking about today, the important part that I can help you and guide you to try to put some level of normalcy, and some level of certainty in your day. While there will always be uncertainty, good mitigation plan is a great thing to have in your back pocket. So thanks for joining us this week at Inside My Canoe Head. Please give us our feedback. Spread the word about this platform and this podcast to all of your other friends. Anybody that you think would really like to know about non-apocalyptic, evidence-based preparedness education for rational people. Because no matter what they tell you on YouTube, the sky is not going to fall. Society's not going to collapse. But holy smokes, it's going to be a wild ride right to 2032. So sit back, grab yourself your favorite reins on the horse. Hang on. It's going to be quite the ride. Take care. Stay safe.